Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025 at 9:01 in the morning. We're here to continue some discussions on the TIFs that are in S-127 that we've been working on. And I thought it would be a good idea for us to understand Act 181 from, I think, was it 2023, 24? Last year. We have legislative counsel with us. Ellen, good morning. Thank you for joining us. To kind of give us a walkthrough of that, I think it'd be good for us to understand what the areas are, A1B, 2, and also understand if there's anything in the background that requires any specific housing built, like or multi-use or the lower income housing in those areas as well. For joining.
Sure. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. I have not been in this committee this year, so it's nice to meet all of you. I am the attorney with Ledge Counsel that handles land use, energy, and climate change. So I don't spend a lot of time in here. But last year, the General Assembly passed Act 181, which is a very large bill, 171 pages. And it was called an act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection through land use. But it really was a huge overhaul of our land use planning system. It changed multiple sections of Act 250 and how its jurisdiction works, as well as municipal planning and regional planning. So part of that bill dealt with changing the Act 250 jurisdictional triggers to create something called the tier system. And so I did provide to you today a PowerPoint that's on your website that goes over the tiered jurisdiction, and I'll walk through that. And the reason I did is because it is referenced in S-127. And so we can start there with what the statute sets out.
Okay. Can you pull it up on the screen?
Yeah, I can share it. Yeah.
Please, thank you.
So to take a step back, Act 250 is the state land use and development law. The primary directive of Act 250 is that no person shall sell a subdivision, commence development, or commence construction of a development without an Act 250 permit. So the definitions of subdivision and development are what we classically know as the Act 250 jurisdictional triggers or jurisdictional thresholds. And there are 10 of them. But the one that comes up most frequently is the one that's highlighted, which is if the project is for a commercial or industrial purpose, it asks what size the parcel is that the project is going to be located on. If it's located on more than 10 acres of land in a town that has permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws, it's known as a 10-acre town, then it will need a permit. If the town doesn't have zoning and the project is being built on more than 1 acre of land, then it will need a permit. So we have this 10-acre, 1-acre distinction. And that distinction is based on the project being a commercial or an industrial project. There's a different trigger for if it's for a governmental purpose or a public purpose. And so largely what has happened under Act 250 is you look at the type of the project. There are also triggers for how many housing units you're building, if you're building housing, or if you're building a communication tower. So under the system for the last 50 years, you look at what the type of the project is, and then that determines whether or not you need a permit. But Act 181 changed that. So the definition of development will now depend on the tier system, which is being created, which is more of a location-based system based on the physical attributes of the site, the natural resources on the site. So the theory being areas with sensitive critical natural resources or natural communities need more Act 250 oversight. The reason being Act 250 doesn't prevent a project from being built, but asks the project to mitigate any adverse impacts on environmental or community criteria. So Act 181 says, okay, if there are critical sensitive natural resources in the area, more Act 250 oversight is needed, therefore less disturbance is needed to trigger the need for a permit. But we also know that there are lots of areas in the state that have been developed. There are areas that communities have identified as being for more intensive development and particularly for high density for housing development. And there's a big push right now, especially to build more housing units. So communities have identified areas where they want to see more things built. And so perhaps less Act 250 oversight is needed there. The areas in between are going to stay the same. And that is a lot of the state. So the whole state will go through this process of being identified as falling into one of the 4 tiers, but it's 3 tiers. Tier 1A, Tier 1B, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And so I'll walk through that. But another part of this is that Act 250 was passed in 1970. And around that time, municipal zoning was becoming more common, but it wasn't prevalent. And so a lot of municipalities were not doing local level review of construction projects. And so this state level review through Act 250 came into play. And at that time, large scale development was happening a lot in southern Vermont, and there wasn't a lot of oversight. And so impacts on the environmental and natural resources in the areas and the communities themselves were becoming a problem. So the state had this oversight through Act 250. But we're 55 years out now, and a lot of municipalities have developed their own municipal zoning programs, and some of them are very sophisticated and detailed. And in some ways, people feel that there's overlap between the review that happens at the municipal level and the state level through Act 250. So using the tier system for places that are going to be getting exempt from Act 250 under Tier 1, the oversight is not going away. The municipality is stepping in the place of where Act 250 was and saying, our review already covers most of what Act 250 was doing. So we no longer need the state level review, but the municipality will be doing that. So first, I'm going to go backwards because Tier 3 is easiest to explain in some ways, but it's not mentioned in S127. Tier 3 are the critical natural resource areas, and it's easy to explain right now because it's pretty short because we have not fully identified these areas. So Tier 3 is defined as critical natural resources defined by rules from the Land Use Review Board. So the Land Use Review Board is going to go through a rulemaking process. It is already underway. They're going to identify what are the critical natural resources in the state that need to have oversight of Act 250 if construction is going to take place on or around them. So the rules have to identify whether and how to protect, at a minimum, river corridors, headwater streams, habitat connectors of statewide significance, riparian areas, Class A waters, natural communities, and other critical natural resources. And there's a rulemaking section in Act 181 that directs the new board to work with ANR. They have to work with ANR because ANR has mapped most of these resources now, so we know where many of them are located. And ANR has all the data on where they are and has done a lot of research on what are the most sensitive, critical, and rare natural communities in the state that will need protection. There are also a list of required stakeholders that will be contributing to the rulemaking process, but there is a rough list of the resources that should be protected under Tier 3, but we don't have the full list yet. And so it's hard to say exactly where and how many of these areas there will be. But any development in a Tier 3 area will trigger the need for a permit. The rules for that are due next year in February of 2026. You need to know what Tier 3 is because it helps you know what Tier 2 is. So Tier 2 is any area that is not Tier 1 or Tier 3. So Tier 3 are these critical natural resources. They're your water bodies, your wetlands, critical natural resources. And Tier 1, which I'll talk about more in the bulk of this presentation, are core centers of towns, your village centers, your downtowns. But Tier 2 is everything in between. And that is a lot of the state. So you think of the core area of a town, but then the sort of village expands out and then further and further before you reach the next town. And so those areas in between is actually quite a bit of the state. Under the new Act 250 program, it will use the existing jurisdictional triggers. But Tier 2 is mentioned in S127. All right, so then Tier 1. So part of Act 181 to determine where all these areas are, Section 49 of Act 181 created a new set of land use categories for use by all of the regional planning commissions to use in their regional plans and maps. And the reason they did that is because while we have these regional planning commissions in the state, they have all adopted plans and maps. They were using different terms and different categories, and so it was hard to sort of translate them between regions. And so this created a new set of land use categories, and all of the RPCs are required to update their maps to use them by December 31st of 2026. They need to work with their towns within their regions to contribute to the maps and identify the areas they want to fall in each land use category. Doing this is important because they then contribute to determining what the Tier 1 areas are. It will also help inform where the Tier 3 areas are as well, because towns know what kind of resources they have within them. But specifically for this program, the thought is a lot of towns will be interested in identifying what the Tier 1 areas are, because those are where Act 250 exemptions will be. So RPCs will need to update their maps to identify what areas fall into them. So what are these areas? So Tier 1A, if an area is designated as Tier 1A, the whole area is exempt from Act 250, and development in that area will fall under the municipal zoning program. Applications for Tier 1A will begin next year, January 1, 2026. And it has to start after the regional plan has already been adopted. So while it can start next year, every region is in a different phase of adopting their plan, but they are all underway. And so it can start next year, but not all of the towns will be ready to apply for Tier 1A next year because their regional plan map has to be done first. And then by resolution of the town, they can apply to the Land Use Review Board for the area in the town that is suitable for dense development and that meets the list of requirements in subsection B, which I'll go over in a minute. And they can have multiple non-contiguous areas receive a 1A status, and they may submit multiple applications at different times. So if over time they've identified a new area of town they want to be 1A, this can happen over time. It doesn't need to happen all at once. So the requirements of Tier 1A, I probably should have put this on 2 slides, but this is the list. So the town has to have a municipal plan that's been approved. They have to have the boundaries of the Tier 1A area be consistent with a downtown or village center land use category for the RPC's maps, or a planned growth area. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide. They also have to have adopted municipal flood hazard and river corridor bylaws that are consistent with or stronger than the standards in the statute. They have to have adopted permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws that do not include broad exemptions that exclude significant private or public land development from meeting a land use permit. And the reason is the requirements in this section are supposed to mirror to an extent the requirements that Act 250 currently looks at. So Act 250 looks at, are there issues in your flood hazard or your river corridor? Are there going to be impacts on the floodway? And so by adopting flood hazard bylaws, you know that the town is going to be looking at the same type of thing that Act 250 would have looked at. So you can't adopt a bylaw program that exempts broad swaths of the town from needing a permit, because that's not what Act 250 would have done. Additionally, the municipality has to have adopted permanent land use regulations that further the smart growth principles, that adequately regulate the physical form and scale of development, which is mostly what municipal zoning does already. Provide reasonable and has to provide a reasonable provision for part of the town with sewer and water to allow buildings with at least 4 stories. And so this is to encourage dense development and building up rather than out, which is part of smart growth. And then conform to any guidelines that the board establishes. It has to address, the area has to be compatible with the character of adjacent National Register of Historic Districts, National or State Register of Historic Sites, or other significant cultural or natural resources identified by the state or local government. And that's because another major component of Act 250 is looking at compatibility with the Division of Historic Preservation's guidelines. They have to have identified and planned for the maintenance of significant natural communities, rare, threatened, and endangered species located on the area, or excluded those areas from Tier 1A. So this is another significant part of Act 250. Act 250 looks at the natural communities and protection of wildlife within areas. And so a lot of these areas will be core downtown areas and may not have to address any issues. But if there are certain areas that are proposed to be part of Tier 1A, they have to have adopted some bylaws for reasonable protection of natural communities and threatened and endangered species. Potentially, that will not be an issue for many communities, but it has to be addressed because that's something Act 250 would have addressed. They also have to have public water and wastewater systems or planned improvements to have the capacity to support additional development, because again, a major part of this program is to allow more development within these areas. And then they also have to have municipal staff adequate to support coordinated, comprehensive, and capital planning, development review, and zoning administration in the Tier 1A area. And that's because this system is stepping in the place of state oversight. So the municipality has to make a demonstration that they have adequate staff to run this program and to administer permits. It's a qualitative standard as opposed to a quantitative standard, because every municipality's workload will be different in this space. Some towns will be busier than others and needing to issue permits and do review.
So, yeah. Can you go back to B and just talk about designated downtown village centers and planned growth areas, because those are actually areas that we deal with.
Yep. So this is on the next slide. I will say there is a distinction. So currently we do have this other program called the Designated Downtown Program. And this is different. And I did try to get them to change the name. I just want to put that out there. These are the land use categories for the RPCs. And so we still have the historic program, and there is overlap. I did try to get them to change the name though, because so on the regional plan map, they need to identify the downtown or village center. And these areas are mixed use center, bringing together community, economic activity, and civic assets. They do include what the areas that have already been designated as downtowns, villages, and new town centers that were previously designated under the existing program, or town areas that are seeking benefits under the new program, the Community Investment Program.
So it encompasses all municipalities
Yes.
that could apply for Tier 1.
Yes. So yes, this part in the regional planning part is looking at what is the mixed use center. And it goes on to say the traditional and historic central business and civic center within a planned growth area, village area, or may stand alone. So it's the traditional core. And under the existing program, some of them may have gotten the designated status. And so, but we know there are only 23 downtowns, 200 villages, and only 3 new town centers. And so there are other towns that could qualify for that program and haven't been designated. But this is just the Regional Planning Commission will go through every town and identify if a center exists within that town to be identified on the map. And then that area could qualify for Tier 1A status if they meet the other municipal requirements. So the Regional Planning Commission will work with the town to identify that within their town and map it, so that then the town will be able to look at if they have the other bylaw requirements to qualify.
Before you go on.
Yep.
Just to repeat, just because it's a designated downtown or village center, it does not automatically fall into a tier 1A, but it could if it meets every one of these other
Yes.
areas.
Yep.
Okay. And then I was looking at the H,
Mhm.
so an area that has public water and wastewater or planned improvements
Mhm.
to have.
Yep.
Does it mean public water or wastewater?
Yeah.
So this new program that we're looking at could allow areas to become 1A, but they're not yet 1A. So they wouldn't be eligible. Like, that's what I'm trying to like.
So all of these things on this list will be part of a municipal application to the board where the municipality will be making an argument. And so one of the things in Act 181 is asking the board to further define at what stage in planned improvements the town needs to be. Because there's this tension there, right? A town may be holding off on improving their water wastewater system because there isn't enough development in that area or enough density to need it. And so, yes, there was this provision added that say if the area has planned improvements for capacity, they can apply to the board. And so we did ask the board to come up with guidelines on what stage of the planning process. Should they have, you know, the tension is a town saying it enough? Do they have to have bonded? Do they have to have hired an engineer to draw up plans? Like what part of that is enough to trigger it to qualify? So we are waiting back on more detail on that. Because it is a little bit of a chicken and egg issue.
I just wanted to make sure that wasn't twisting myself into a pretzel for reason at all. It is kind of a little bit of a.
Yes, it is. And hopefully the board is coming up with a recommendation on how to address that for towns.
I mean, before a town does an improvement or needs to improve, they have to be looking at some whatever area is designated for growth. And so in order for them to be able to, under 127, access the CHIP program or whatever it comes out to be, I think that's where that could help the land use board know that if we're looking at this, here's a project, working on the contract, all of that stuff, in order to get that designation of 1A.
Right, and this was drafted last
Before.
year, so this, yeah. But these are areas that a town hopefully had already identified as where they wanted growth and were planning for growth and addressing needs for growth. And so there will be towns that are in different stages of that. Yeah.
And the municipal staff,
Yeah.
can that be a contractor that a municipality contracts with instead of having, is that considered municipal staff as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think especially this, I always feel defensive of this sentence because I feel like it's more flexible than people realize. And it is adequate to what that municipality needs. Burlington's needs for a zoning department will be different than what Westford needs. And so I think it's flexible in that way. However, the municipality is staffing their development, their land use review program.
A question relates to that. Is it possible for like smaller municipalities to share staff and still be compliant?
Yes. So as long as they're able to make the demonstration that they have people staffing the department, and that is happening. And a really common thing is the RPCs are doing work with the municipalities to address this. Yeah. Yeah. It's actually spelled out in more detail in 1B, because people were nervous about the 1B, but this will happen when a municipality goes before the board with an application and they'll have to say, how do you have adequate municipal staff? And they will say, we have staffed the department
This
as
is-
X, yeah.
Bridget, if there's any questions you have to just.
So the other area that can qualify for tier 1A, it can either be the downtown or village center and then planned growth areas. So areas that are mapped in the regional plan map that include high density existing settlements and future growth areas. So with high concentrations of population, housing, and employment in the region and town, they include a mix of historic and non-historic, commercial, residential, civic, and cultural sites with active streetscapes supported by land use regulations, public water or wastewater, or both multimodal transportation systems. So these areas include designated new town centers, downtowns, village centers, growth centers, and neighborhood development areas. So all of the previously designated areas. And they have to meet the smart growth principles. And then there's some additional criteria here. So the town has to have adopted a plan and have their planning process confirmed by the RPC. They have to have public water or wastewater infrastructure. The area has to be generally within walking distance from the municipality or an adjacent municipality's downtown, village center, new town center, or growth center. So this is one of the only other sort of locational requirements because these areas are not sort of clearly designated or based on size, but generally walking distance of the downtown areas.
So what is the distance?
My walking distance?
So the RPC is actually,
Mine.
so actually, if you want more information on this generally, especially with how the RPCs are adopting and identifying these areas, you may want to hear from the regional planners. They're already undertaking this work. And I believe I heard them say that they already have a standard because they've already been doing this type of review currently. And I believe it's between 1.5 miles is what they roughly use as walking distance. But I'm pretty sure I remember them saying that this is something that they already take into account because of the smart growth principles and the multimodal transportation systems. They already have that sort of addressed. And so I think they have a standard that they internally apply to what is considered walkable, but I think it is less than 1 mile. They have to have identified the flood hazard areas or exclude the flood hazard areas from these areas unless they're compatible or suitable for infill development as defined. They have to have these areas intended for higher density residential and mixed use development. And they have to provide these areas will provide housing that meets the need of diverse social and economic groups. And these areas have to have complete streets compatibility. So they have to have multimodal transportation in this area. For this tier 1A, it is largely correlated with the existing designated downtowns, village centers, new town centers, but it will be other areas identified in the regional plan maps. And then tier 1B is a lot simpler after that. So tier 1B has a slightly different process. This will happen before the tier 1A areas because it will be initially part of the first round of review when the Land Use Review Board reviews the new updated regional plans and their maps. So the regional planning commissions will be required to submit their updated regional plans and maps for review by the Land Use Review Board. This is a new process that hasn't happened before. They'll be reviewing to see that they comply with the new land use categories, and they will be the Regional Planning Commission will be working with the town to identify the tier 1A, the tier 1B areas on these new maps. So the board is going to produce guidelines to additionally spell this out, but a municipality may have multiple non-contiguous areas for tier 1B. So to get a tier 1B area, the municipality has to request it and they will work with the regional planning commission to identify what area the town is for tier 1B. They have to have a town plan that's been adopted, and approved, and a planning process that's approved. And they have to have permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws. The area has to exclude flood hazard areas and fluvial erosion areas, except those areas with pre-existing development that are suitable for infill development. The municipality has to have water supply, wastewater infrastructure, or soils that can accommodate a community system for compact housing development. And they have to have municipal staff, municipal officials, or contract capacity adequate to support the development and reprogram. And so these areas will be able to have projects with up to 50 units of housing exempt from Act 250. So Tier 1A is a full Act 250 exemption for any kind of project. Tier 1B is focused on the development of housing units. So projects that are going to be located in Tier 1B areas will be able to get 50 units of housing exempt from Act 250.
So is that exemption total for the town, or is that total for each area that's designated?
Just the Tier 1B area that's designated.
So you could have multiple tier 1B areas so they could sustain up to 50 housing units.
Yes, and the area will probably so the areas that it will cover are what's called on the regional map, the village areas. And so I think these will be sort of neighborhood size or multiple neighborhood size Tier 1B areas. So you will potentially be able to construct multiple 50 unit projects, not just one per tier 1B area.
Reach out.
Yeah. On the wastewater infrastructure, is that the added, it says,
Yep.
soils that can accommodate, is that at its current capacity, or that it's there, or it has the ability to expand?
Yeah, that can accommodate for compact housing. So yes, it has to be able to address increased density.
Okay. Meaning that if it is a current system, it can be expanded.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your question.
No, or I have a question too. So am I reading this right, that if you're a town, you could have a 1B without having a 1A?
Yes. And I think that will be common because there will be towns that don't necessarily have a core and or who don't necessarily have the resources or the interest to adopt the additional requirements necessary to achieve 1A.
That makes sense.
It's a lower barrier to get the 1B. It has less requirements for the town to administer.
So question on just the slide, you have at the very top, you have A and then you have a C. Is B just something that didn't directly apply?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so this statute, section 6033 is longer because it's also about generally the regional plan review.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that
Yep.
I wasn't, and then again, it has to have all 6 of these items.
Yep.
And 5 is an or. It doesn't have to have all, it's.
Yes.
So you could have, sounds like you have to have a wastewater system. I mean, a water supply system. But you can have either wastewater system already in place, or you have soils that can accommodate a new system for that area.
Actually, it's yes, but one of the three. So they can have water supply or wastewater infrastructure or soils.
You can be on
So you could do a
wells
well.
with soils.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
But you could have one.
Important to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, so I guess I'm wondering in 6. So in 1A, it didn't go into detail.
Yes.
And then here we're going into and I think maybe that's where there's some confusion of.
So this was a floor amendment.
That explains it.
It kind of does explain it, right? So there was particular concern about being very clear for this lower barrier program that any type of staffing would be necessary. I think as the new board does its work, there may be a recommendation to make sure these language matches.
Line up, yeah.
Yes.
See where they should.
Flora Bedwood. Yep.
It's
We
too
can
bad
add
they
it to
didn't.
127.
Yeah, we could.
Oh, yeah.
Could have been 1A, so it's.
Sure, you could do that, yeah. The other thing I wanted to add based on Rep. Granning's question was for tier 1A, I did not go into the like full detail of the process for the steps that a municipality will go through with the LURB. If you have interest in like the actual approval process, I can talk about that. There's a required hearing. The board has to respond within 45 days, the yay or nay, and there's a annual cycle, 8-year cycle of review to make sure the
So
municipality.
it kind of mirrors the planning.
Yes, yep. And that's what will happen with tier 1B as well, because the regional plans will come up for review and they'll also just be checking to see if the municipality's requirements are still in compliance.
Are they, is the thought aligning the tiers in with the town plan or city plans?
Yes, the overall, so because there is also additional language in 181. Yes, it is a real vertical alignment between regional state Act 250 system with the regional plan with the town plan. So that all should be in alignment.
Make it a lot easier for the municipality, so they're not having to, this year we're doing this, next year we're doing that.
2 questions. I'm going to start with the easier one, I think. 1B areas, can they be contiguous if it's a town border? So if 2 towns abut each other and it doesn't say that you can't. So could they put their 1B areas abutting?
Yes, I don't think that came up specifically, and so I don't think it's precluded. But I
The board
think,
would please.
yeah, yeah, I don't think there's anything in here that particularly excludes that. The Regional Planning Commission will be working with the towns as they do this work, so towns will be aware of what, to some extent, what the other towns are doing. And there is the process by which the towns have to, or the RPCs have to provide notice to each town specifically, when they're working on developing the maps, asking for feedback on the maps, having hearings on the maps, and asking for input before they submit them to be approved. So there's multiple stages at which the municipalities will be able to weigh in. But I don't think that has come up as something that is prohibited.
And then the timeline. So we're looking at 2020, beginning of 26,
Mhm.
that the maps are going to be created.
So the map work is underway. They are due by the end of next year.
At the end of 26.
Yep, and so they can start submitting them for review to the board by next year. The board is not quite ready to be doing that review yet, but in 2026, we anticipate the board will be doing the review and approval of these. And so there is a timeline for the board has to review and approve within 45 days the regional plans. And so the Tier 1B process will happen when the LURB reviews the regional plan. And then if the regional plan is approved, the Tier 1B area will be in effect and the Act 250 exemption can start taking effect. The Tier 1A area process will start after their regional plan has been adopted. So they won't happen all at once, which I think is helpful for the board, but they will happen over a period of years into 2027 and potentially beyond, depending how long it takes them.
So in the meantime, we had set guidelines on what is exempt from Act 250. Is that the next thing?
Yeah. Can I just finish this one last slide
Yeah.
before so what the Tier 1A or the Tier 1B areas correlate to are these village areas. And so they're the areas around and adjacent to what were the downtown and village centers. So they're the traditional settlement areas or proposed new settlement areas, cohesive mix of residential, civic, religious, commercial, and mixed-use buildings arranged along a main street and intersecting streets that are within walking distance for residents who live within and surrounding the core. They include existing village centers and similar areas statewide, but it's larger than the village center designation. And they have to have the following: they have to have a town plan and planning process, the bylaws, the flood hazard and river corridor bylaws, municipal water and wastewater or adequate soils. And they have to have the opportunity for infill development so that they can grow and be flood resilient. So these will be slightly larger areas potentially than the downtowns. And so that's what I did slides on, but yes, there are other parts of S-127. So
Go back to, what you were talking about. No, I don't need this
Okay.
slide, but, as I think you mentioned, there is, while all this, tier one, tier B, all the tiers, planning is going on, and that's going to be ultimately decided by the review board. Regional plans are also in the process of, adapting to the new, land use areas, that need to be in the regional plan, and the municipalities need to be in conformance with that too. Can you, and those, I'm assuming are going to make some changes in municipal plans, in terms of housing in particular. And I'm wondering, so what's the timeline that you understand, for the changes to regional and municipal plans, versus the tier 1A, 1B, et cetera?
So, the tiers are gonna have to happen after the regional plans. And the regional plans are the only ones that have a firm deadline of, they were given after this bill passed last year until the end of 2026 to update their regional plans to conform with the statute.
At the end of when again?
2026, December 2026, they have to have updated to include the new requirements and then make their application to the board for approval.
Yeah,
They've met the
because I think
requirements.
that's important, for us to keep in mind. And there's not just the tier system that's going into effect. There's also these different land use areas that might include changes to how housing is or isn't permitted. That's going on, sounds like basically at the same time.
Yeah. And so there isn't a specific requirement or timeline for the towns to do their work, but if towns towns may be motivated to make changes in order to be able to comply with the requirements of Tier 1A. And so there isn't a specific timeline on that other than if they're going to adopt new bylaws to address the things required in Tier 1A, which will allow them to be exempt from Act 250. That will take some time and then they'll be able to apply to the board. So there isn't a specific timeline for them to do that other than when they want to be able to get that Act 250 exemption.
Yeah, it might be different in other regions. I know that in our region, in Madison County, they're actively, reaching out to municipalities with their future land use maps, and talking with the towns and how to get in sync, because ultimately the regional map is going to control.
Yep.
So 1A, they follow everything, they're exempt on anything that they do. So commercial housing. 1B is specific housing.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, I think that's good for us to know when we're talking about. Yeah.
Last question. There, it came up a couple of times where we were talking about affordable housing, that the amount of housing able to be built, let's say the 50 units in the 1B areas, could be increased if there was affordable housing, and that was not addressed in this new statute. It's old.
Yeah, there's no specific provision for affordable housing.
Okay, so there's no, it's not 70 homes if it's a certain percentage that is affordable. It's 50 units, full stop.
Yep. So there's a couple other things at S-127 for the location requirement. So in S-127 location criteria, E1 is tier 1A or tier 1B, or an area exempt from Act 250 under 6081DD, which is the interim housing exemptions. So under Act 81, there was also a set of interim housing exemptions until the tiers take place, or roughly until the tiers take place. And those are exemptions for the areas that already are designated areas. So designated downtowns have a full exemption on housing. Let me see if I can get there. Until 2027. Then there's also the exemption for village centers, 50 units of housing and 1/4 mile around the village center. And then for, I went in reverse. So one is 75 units of housing located in a designated new town center, growth center, or neighborhood development area that are served by public sewer or water, or have soils that are adequate for waste disposal. Then there's also 50 units of housing are exempt in village centers and within 1/4 mile around the village center if it has permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws and sewer or water or soils. Then there's also 50 units of housing are exempt in areas of a municipality that are within a census designated urbanized area with over 50,000 residents and within 1/4 mile of a transit route. This is a very specific exemption for a part of Chittenden County. The census designated urbanized area is a US Census Bureau definition. There's only one part of Vermont that has that. It is part of Chittenden County, and it has to be located within 1/4 mile of a transit route. And so that primarily involves Route 7. And then there's also any housing units constructed within a downtown that has permanent zoning and subdivision bylaws, as well as the sewer or water or soil. So the interim exemptions primarily correlate with the existing designated areas. And then there's also that weird exemption for urbanized areas.
Can you repeat the 75 unit one? I
Sure.
should look it up in the Vermont policy.
Yeah, so it's 75 units of housing located within a designated new town center, growth center, or neighborhood development area, and served by public sewer or water or soils. And so that is until January 1, 2027. The 50 units of housing for village center or census designated areas until July 1, 2027. And then the any housing in a downtown is January 1, 2027.
We like to make things complicated.
Yeah, right.
I wrote so many amendments to this section that it got, confusing.
So that last special section. Is there a unit exemption?
It's any housing.
Okay.
Yeah. And it does not specifically require affordable. There's no affordability requirement.
But there could be an ordinance within a municipality that has a requirement.
So then there's two other categories in the locational requirement. So an area designated as tier 2, or an area in which the housing development site is compatible with regional and town land use plans as evidenced by a letter of support from the Regional Planning Commission. And so just to say, I did not testify. I haven't testified at all in this bill until yesterday, so I hadn't actually seen this language. So that's a lot of area, just this bucket.
Section 2 on page 32.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know what areas. So tier 2 covers a significant part of the state, and then it's or an area where housing is compatible. I'm having a hard time picturing the difference between those two areas.
VAPTA had proposed a adjustment to the language there to actually remove it from the original planning commission from section 2 into look E, just more generally. So it's about 1 and 2 altogether. So it's better.
Okay, I think those two things overlap entirely almost. And so I just didn't know why that distinction was made. Yeah.
Say again, which page you're talking?
Page 32, in S127, subdivision 2 under E, the location requirement.
I noted that as well. And what I was told by folks who were interested in the bill that it was intended, although I don't think it's all that clear, but it was intended to take into account when the tiers were going to be approved. So what do
Okay.
before 2026, December, I think 2026.
Okay,
How would this apply? And so I sort of put that or in there, but I asked the question too.
Okay. okay.
But you're saying it's covered under 10 BSA 6081.
No,
It's not.
no, I'm saying, tier 2. So in number, just within number 2, I mean, I think,
Repetitive.
yeah. But I think what you just said makes a lot of sense in that, like, if it were to happen like tomorrow before the maps come out and just having the RPC sign off that it's compatible, I think, I guess that is a reasonable
Yeah, I think it
explanation.
reflecting that there'd be a period of time when this passes, the program would be in effect, but before the tiers would be defined.
Okay. And then the last one is number 3, and it's an existing settlement or an area within 1/2 mile of an existing settlement. And so this is also an Act 250 term. And so I do just want to flag that for you. So existing settlement is defined as any area that's already been designated as one of the designated areas. So either a downtown, village center, new town center, growth center, or neighborhood development area. So that is, again, slightly repetitive to 1, but I guess perhaps that's until tier 1 has been identified. But the other part of that definition is, so either a designated area or an existing center that is compact in form and size, that contains a mixture of uses that includes a substantial residential component and that are within walking distance of each other, that has significantly higher densities than densities that occur outside the center, and that is typically served by municipal infrastructure such as wastewater, sidewalks, paths, transit, parking areas, and public parks or greens, and it does not include strip development. So I do also think that that is repetitive to tier 1, but perhaps redundant to tier 1, but perhaps again, this is a way to use it before the tiers are fully adopted. But I'm not sure.
Are there, until the maps are done, we know what's a tier 1A, 1B to all of that. So we have these areas now that could apply for exemptions. Do they have to apply for an exemption or is it automatic given? If they're designated downtown, village center, new growth area, if they're all of these, can they now just forego Act 250?
Yes, under the interim housing provisions, yeah.
And so does all the criteria match 1A or 1B?
So 1A was intended to capture most of the Act 250 criteria. Tier 1B, no. Tier 1A was intended to capture most. I do think there are some that are missing, but that was the legislature's decision. So the original intent was yes, but and the municipality, some of Act 250 criteria are specific to municipality anyways, and so the municipality will be keeping those in mind, so they weren't restated, but yeah.
So there may be an advantage until everything is done for municipalities to try to work with a developer sponsor to get this through, but they still won't have chip to fall back on. So they still would have the exemption, so they wouldn't have to go through that whole permitting process. But imagine they still have to go through the permitting process with the municipality, right? So they, yeah. That's the point. But it does lessen that whole process, so it can speed things up in getting housing or getting commercial production going in a designated downtown, right?
Well, right now, the interim exemptions are just.
Only for housing.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions for Ellen?
I more of a comment than anything, that it just, we're going through this right now. In the town of Milton, because I'm chair of the planning commission. And we were pretty proactive with RPC. And they've already come down and they've told us, well, here's your tier 2B or tier 1B area. And then they gave us a laundry list of what we need to do to make it tier 1A. So just to put out there, the RPCs have been very, very helpful in doing all this. And I would just encourage you to reach out to them, because I think they might be able to answer a lot of the questions on it.
I think for us, it's more of how do we integrate this chip program into
Yeah.
what is existing and what the law change was. Making sure that we're not creating something that's going to conflict with what we passed last year. So it doesn't conflict with Act 181.
Yeah, and I did want to add, one thing I can't speak to specifically is how geographically large these areas are. And they definitely have more information on roughly how large they map the tier 1A and tier 1B.
Any other questions?
Very helpful.
Ellen, thank you.
It's very nice to see all of you.
Good to have you in. What's the budget? So we were planning on having the treasurer in this morning and he can't make it today. We're running into kind of buzzsaws this week. We were hoping to have on in with a new draft that we could go over with him, and John's not available. He's tied up with institutions, committees on both sides of the House and the Senate, and he's also tied up with education on the Senate side. We're hoping that he will be able to come talk to us tomorrow morning, I think. After we hear from, we're hoping the treasurer, if they come in at 9, we're hoping to hear from Gus Seelig, from the HCB after that, and then start looking at a new draft with John. And go from there. We're trying to see if we can get just partly even in to talk to us about how that process works with municipality, what we're planning on doing. So if once municipality has their debt set, we know how much they have to pay every year. They're looking at growth, right? The taxable growth. And that if the taxable growth is over and above what they need, then I think the thought is the money goes into the education fund, the extra. But we're also thinking maybe there should be some that's retained in a special fund, just in case one year some crazy reason, but it could happen that property values drop and they don't raise enough money to meet their bond payment or whatever payment they're making, that there's a reserve fund there for them to utilize that. And then in the end, if that if they haven't used any or whatever money's left in that would go into the ed fund again. So that's what we're thinking. But I think we need to understand how that all works and who's doing what and who's capturing and where the money goes and all that. So I think it'd be good for us to understand how that whole mechanism works. Haven't heard back from her yet. So why don't we take a 15-minute break and come back at 10:15? We'll see if we've heard from Jess or not, and if not, we can start having some discussions on what we've heard, all the information we've taken in, kind of what, some thoughts that we're having on creating a new draft for people to look at and go from there.